Jim River Flat, Dakota Territory, November 1873. The wind had teeth, and it was already chewing on the corner of the world. The first snows of the season didn't fall so much as they flew sideways, a horizontal blizzard of white grit that scoured the new-sawn planks of every claim cabin standing raw against the sky. Most men were inside, chinking the last gaps with mud and newspaper, stacking the last of their precious cordwood. But Halvard Nessheim was outside. He wasn't fighting the snow. He wasn't shoveling it away from his door or clearing a path to his lean-to. He was collecting it. With a wide, flat-headed wooden tamper he'd made from an old barrel stave, the Norwegian was packing the wet, heavy snow into a low, thick wall against the north side of his small cabin. DeWitt Colfrey, the county land surveyor, reined in his horse, pulling his collar tighter against the biting wind. He sat with Silas Pritchard, a farmer whose land abutted Nessheim's. They watched the solitary figure working with a strange, methodical rhythm. Scoop, place, tamp. Scoop, place, tamp. What in God's name is he doing? Pritchard shouted over the wind, his words snatched away almost before they were spoken. Colfrey didn't need to shout. His voice was low and carried the weight of professional certainty. He's building his own tomb. He gestured with a gloved hand. He's piling snow against his own house. It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen a man do. When that pile gets high enough, the weight will press in, and when it thaws, it will slump and take that wall down with it. The man is crazy. Pritchard squinted, his face a mask of wind-burned confusion. He's Norwegian. Maybe it's some old country nonsense. It's nonsense, all right, Colfrey said, shaking his head. And it's dangerous nonsense. He watched Nessheim pause, look at his work, and then continue, seemingly oblivious to their judgment. A man methodically constructing what any sane plainsman knew to be a fatal mistake. What did this Norwegian cedar builder, a man from the high mountain pastures of a distant land, understand about the conductive power of packed snow that a professional land surveyor, a man who measured the very earth, had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn something profound about the physics of survival. We'll explore the difference between conduction and convection, the hidden insulating power of still air, and why the most powerful solutions are sometimes found not in fighting a force of nature, but in harnessing it. If you've ever felt a draft you just couldn't plug, this story is for you. Subscribe for more stories of frontier ingenuity and let me know in the comments, what's the most counterintuitive solution you've ever seen work? Halvard Nessheim was not a carpenter, not in the way the men at the land office understood the term. He was not a farmer, though he now stood on 160 acres of unforgiving sod. On the plains of Dakota, he was an outsider, a man whose skills seemed ill-suited to the vast horizontal world he now inhabited. In his former life, he had been a cedar builder. In the high Jotunheimen mountains of Norway, he built the small, sturdy huts used by shepherds during the summer grazing season. His hands knew the heft of granite fieldstone, the precise scribe of a log cope, the weight of a living sod roof. His work was meant to withstand the crushing snows and hurricane-force winds of a mountain winter, keeping the empty structures sound until the shepherds returned in spring. Every autumn, as the herds were driven down to the valleys, Halvard would perform the final ritual of his trade, the snowbygg, or snow building. He would bank the first heavy, wet snows against the stone foundations of the cedar, packing it into a dense, seamless barrier that would freeze solid and sheath the hut for the long months of darkness. It was a practice as old as the mountains themselves, a simple act of working with the winter, not against it. But Dakota was not Jotunheimen. His first winter on the Jim River Flat in 1872 had been a brutal education. He had built his cabin as his neighbors did, with cottonwood logs, mud chinking, and a single plank door. He had laid in what he thought was a generous supply of wood. It was not enough. That winter, the cold was not a season. It was a predator. It found every crack, every weakness. One morning in January, he went to get his axe and found the hickory haft had split clean at the eye, the wood fibers torn apart by the contracting force of the intense cold. Inside the cabin, his wife, Ingrid, had pointed to the candle on their small table. The flame, usually a steady, upright teardrop of light, leaned a full 40 degrees to the south, held there by the unceasing river of frigid air pouring through the north wall. It never flickered. It simply bent, a living compass needle pointing toward the source of their misery. The packed mud chinking he had so carefully applied had turned to dust, crumbling out from between the logs, leaving tiny gaps that whistled a high, mournful tune. He, Ingrid, and their two small children, Lars and Solveig, spent most of that winter huddled in a single bed, buried under every blanket and coat they owned. Halvard swore it would not happen again. He would not be a victim of the Dakota winter. He would be its partner. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of material, but a failure of understanding. The settlers brought with them building techniques from the wooded hills of Ohio, the sheltered valleys of Pennsylvania. Those methods were no match for the physics of the open plains. The primary enemy was the wind. A 30-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't just feel colder, it actively steals heat. This process is called convective stripping. The air molecules slam against the outer wall, absorb thermal energy from the wood, and are instantly replaced by a new wave of cold molecules. The log wall, which might have a minimal insulating R value of 4 inches still air, effectively had an R value of less than 1 in the face of a constant plains wind. It was like trying to stay warm by wearing a wool coat in a cold river. For Halvard's neighbors, the Pritchard family, this meant a constant losing battle. Silas and his sons spent half their waking hours feeding their cast-iron stove. They were burning through their winter woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stack diminishing daily. By Christmas, Silas was already eyeing the cottonwoods down by the river, calculating how many he'd need to fell just to make it to March. Inside their cabin, the single-pane glass window was a sheet of white ice, an inch thick on the inside. Water froze in the bucket 6 feet from the stove. The cold was a physical presence, a heavy, oppressive blanket that drove them into a small circle around the fire, their backs freezing while their faces roasted. Their problem wasn't a lack of fire. The problem was that the heat they produced was being ripped away from their home faster than the stove could generate it. They were trying to heat the entire Dakota territory, one log at a time. The cold was winning. Halvard began his work in late November, with the first snow that was wet enough to pack. He ignored the stares from the few riders on the trail and the head shaking of his neighbors. He started on the northwest corner, the point of the spear for the winter winds. He laid a 4-foot-wide foundation of snow, tamping it down with his handmade tool until it was dense and firm. He worked in layers or lifts, each about a foot high, packing each one before adding the next. The critical element, the part no one else could understand, was the gap. He was not piling the snow directly against his log walls. He was carefully maintaining a space, a consistent 2-foot-wide corridor of still air between the logs of his home and the inner face of his snow wall. To his neighbors, this was the ultimate proof of his madness. Not only was he building a foolish snow wall, but he was leaving a space for the cold to pool up, right next to his home. DeWitt Colfrey made a special trip out from the county seat to see the progress. He found Halvard working on the west wall, the berm now rising above the eaves of the cabin. Nesheim, Colfrey began, his tone a mixture of official concern and exasperation. I've been a surveyor in this territory for 10 years. I understand weight and pressure. You have close to 20 tons of snow piled up there, and you're not even done. It's unstable. The first Chinook that comes through, or the first heavy melt in the spring, and that entire mass is going to slump. It will collapse inward and crush your north wall clean in. It could smother you and your family in your sleep. It was a professional opinion, delivered with the confidence of a man who dealt in empirical facts. It wasn't just mockery. It was a threat to Nesheim's reputation with the very land patent agent for whom coal-free would be a reference. Halvard paused his tamping. He looked at the massive white structure, then at the surveyor. He spoke a single quiet sentence. "The cold will hold it." He then turned and went back to his work. The mockery lasted for 3 weeks. The validation would last for a generation. By the time the first true blizzard was on the horizon, the structure was complete. It was a massive, curving rampart of packed snow, 18 feet high at its peak, that wrapped around the north and west sides of the cabin. It was smooth and dense, sculpted by the wind into a shape that encouraged the prevailing gales to slide up and over it, like a wave breaking on a smooth stone. From the exposed south and east, the Nesheim cabin looked ordinary. From the north, it had vanished, replaced by a steep white hill that looked like a natural feature of the landscape. Hidden behind it was Halvard's secret weapon, a 2-foot-wide pocket of absolutely still air. The problem tormenting the settlers of the Jim River Flat wasn't simply the cold. The problem was thermodynamics, the relentless, unforgiving science of heat transfer. Heat moves in 3 ways: radiation, convection, and conduction. Radiation is the warmth you feel from a fire across a room. Convection is heat moved by a fluid, like the wind stealing warmth from a wall. And conduction is heat moving through a solid material, like the handle of a hot skillet. The standard cabin was vulnerable to all 3, but especially convection. Halvard Nesheim's snow berm, or snow big, was a masterclass in thermal physics. It attacked the problem on 2 fronts. First, and most obviously, it stopped the wind. By creating a massive aerodynamic barrier, the 55-mile-per-hour convective force of the blizzard was completely neutralized at the cabin's wall. The wind simply flew over the top of the berm, leaving the air in the 2-foot gap between snow and wood perfectly still. This single act eliminated the primary source of heat loss for every other cabin on the prairie. But the second part was the true genius. The berm itself became a massive insulator through its low conductivity. A wind-scoured cottonwood log at 0 degrees Fahrenheit is a poor barrier to heat. It conducts heat away from the cabin's interior relatively quickly. Packed snow, however, is mostly trapped air. The intricate matrix of ice crystals creates billions of tiny pockets where air cannot move. And still air is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. The numbers are staggering. The packed snow of Halvard's berm conducted heat 20 times slower than the wood siding of his cabin. He had essentially wrapped his home in a blanket, with an R value of 40 or more, a level of insulation modern builders would envy. This combination created the magic of the still air pocket. The tiny, unavoidable amount of heat that did conduct through the log walls was no longer stripped away by the wind. Instead, it gently warmed the captive air in the 2-foot gap. This trapped air stabilized at a temperature far above the ambient cold, while the blizzard raged at 27 degrees below zero on the outside of the berm. The air resting against Halvard's cabin walls was a comparatively mild 25 to 30 degrees above zero. He hadn't just built a wall against the cold. He had created a thermal buffer zone, a climate of his own making, where the temperature difference his walls had to fight was not 100 degrees, but a mere 40. In late January of 1874, the sky turned a milky, ominous gray. The temperature plummeted. Then the ground blizzard hit. It was a uniquely terrifying phenomenon of the northern plains. It wasn't about falling snow, but blowing snow. The wind, a steady, screaming 55 miles per hour, picked up the loose snow from the prairie and created a horizontal hurricane of ice particles. Visibility dropped to 0 above the knee. The sun vanished. The world shrank to a roaring, white chaos. The storm would last for 4 days. For the Pritchard family, it was a waking nightmare. They stuffed rags into the whistling cracks around their doorframe. The fine, flour-like snow was driven through invisible gaps, forming small drifts on their floor. They burned their chairs, then the boards, from their unused loft. The sound of the wind was a physical assault, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through the very logs of the cabin, a monster trying to tear its way in. In the Nesheim cabin there was quiet. The roar of the wind was a distant thing, a high, thin sound passing far overhead. Inside the small, warm space, the world was still. The candle on the table burned with a perfect, unwavering flame. Ingrid sat in her rocking chair, mending one of Lars's socks, the needle passing in and out of the wool with calm precision. The air was so still her sewing thread hung limp. The children, Lars and Solveig, were asleep on a pallet near the stove, breathing the deep, even breaths of untroubled sleep. They wore simple wool shirts, not the layers of coats their neighbors' children endured. The warmth was even, consistent, reaching every corner of the small room. Halvard had used less than a quarter of the wood the Pritchards had already burned through. He sat at the table, carving a small wooden horse for his son, the shavings curling neatly at his feet. They were not surviving. They were living. DeWitt Colfrey had made a fatal miscalculation. Believing the storm front was still a day away, he and his 2-man survey party had ridden out to finalize a section line 10 miles north of the Nesheim claim. The ground blizzard struck with shocking speed, catching them on the open prairie. Within minutes, they were blind, disoriented, and in mortal danger. The wind was a physical force, knocking them from their saddles. Their horses, panicked, bolted into the white chaos. Frostbite was setting in, their faces numb, their fingers turning to clumsy blocks of wood. Colfrey knew their only chance was to find shelter. The only structure for miles was Nesheim's cabin and its strange snow hill. They linked arms and began a desperate, stumbling march in what they prayed was the right direction. Hours passed. They were on the verge of collapse when one of his men, a young chain carrier named Evans, fell, and his hand hit something solid and vertical. It was the berm. They had found it, but the door was on the sheltered east side, 100 feet away around the curve of the snow wall. To walk that distance in the full force of the gale was impossible. They would be separated and lost in seconds. "A rope!" Colfrey croaked, his voice raw. "We need to anchor a rope." He had a coil on his pack, but what to anchor it to? The snow wall was too smooth. Then he remembered the cabin, the logs. If he could get into the gap between the berm and the house, he could drive a piton between the logs and secure a lifeline. He got on his belly, the wind tearing at his back, and began to crawl into the narrow opening at the south end of the berm. He expected the wind to shear and accelerate through the gap, a vortex of even more intense cold. He braced himself for the biting freeze. The moment his head and shoulders cleared the opening, it happened. Silence. The 55-mile-per-hour roar that had been his entire world for hours simply vanished. The air was dead, utterly, profoundly still, and it was warm. The shock of it was so complete he stopped crawling, bewildered. The air on his face, which had been painfully frozen, now felt like the air in a cool cellar. It was a temperature he had not felt in days, a temperature that meant life. Without thinking, as a purely instinctual act, he reached up and pulled down the frozen wool face wrap that had been frozen to his beard. He took a deep, clean breath of air that didn't burn his lungs. He crawled forward, his entire body now inside the protected space. He looked up. 10 feet above, he could see the blizzard raging past the lip of the berm, a river of white fury. Down here, not a single snowflake stirred. It was a pocket of impossible calm, carved directly out of the heart of the storm. He saw the logs of Nessheim's cabin, bare and dry. Nailed to one of the logs, at eye level, was a small tin, the kind used for lard. On a numb impulse, he reached out with a gloved hand and pushed his thumb against the lid. It gave. The lard inside was cool, but soft and scoopable. In that moment, the surveyor, a man of lines and numbers, understood. The Norwegian wasn't crazy. He was a genius. After anchoring the rope and getting his men safely to the door, they spent 2 days recovering in the stunning warmth and quiet of the Nessheim cabin. When the blizzard finally broke, the sun glinting on a world transformed into a sea of white, Kolfri was a changed man. His professional certainty had been shattered and replaced by a profound, humbling respect. He walked back to the snow berm, this time with Halvard. He carried a small hand axe. "My men won't believe it," he said. "People at the depot won't believe it. They need to see." He led Halvard to the east gable of the cabin, the only wall left exposed to the wind. Nailed there, as a control experiment Kolfri hadn't even known existed, was an identical lard tin. He tapped it with his finger. It was a white stone, frozen solid. He swung the hatchet. The tin split with a sharp crack, revealing lard as hard and brittle as rock. Then, he led Halvard back into the pocket of calm. He pointed to the other tin, the one he had touched during the storm. "May I?" he asked. Halvard nodded. Kolfri took the tin from its nail, pried open the lid with his thumbnail, and scooped out a perfect, soft swirl of lard with his forefinger. He held it up for his men to see. The proof was simple, physical, and undeniable. One of Kolfri's party was a quartermaster sergeant from Fort Ransom, who had been traveling with them to scout a new supply route. The sergeant, a practical man named Hobbs, looked from the shattered tin to the soft lard, his mind racing with the logistical implications. He saw the fuel savings, the increased health and morale of soldiers in winter quarters. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil. He didn't speak to Halvard with condescension or awe, but with the respect of one professional to another. "Mr. Nessheim, would you mind if I took some measurements?" he asked. For the next hour, Hobbs sketched the berm. He drew its curved profile, noted the height, the width of the base, the critical 2-foot air gap. He asked Halvard about the type of snow, the method of packing, the orientation to the wind. Halvard answered in his typical fashion, short, direct, factual sentences. There was no boasting, no "I told you so." He simply shared what he knew. That spring, Sergeant Hobbs's detailed sketch and notes were entered into the official record of the Department of Dakota, under the heading, Field Notes on Effective Winter Quarters Construction, Non-Standard Methods. The knowledge began to spread. Halvard Nessheim had no formal training in building science. He had never heard of an R-value or a BTU, but with tools of observation, tradition, and necessity, he had created a structure that was a century ahead of its time. Modern high-performance building is centered on a few key principles: massive levels of insulation, an airtight building envelope, and control of environmental forces. Nessheim's cabin, with its snow berm, achieved all three. The packed snow was a form of super insulation, far exceeding anything a log wall could provide. The berm, combined with the tight-scribed logs, created an almost perfect air barrier, protecting the home from infiltration. He had in effect built a passive house on the Dakota prairie. His snow wall was the precursor to the double-stud walls and thick insulation blankets that are now the standard for energy-efficient construction in cold climates. He demonstrated a principle that architects and engineers would spend the next 100 years rediscovering, that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest. The other settlers on the Jim River Flat saw the winter as an enemy. It was a force to be fought, a siege to be endured. They built their cabins like forts and barricaded themselves inside, feeding immense quantities of fuel into their stoves in a desperate head-on battle against the cold. They fought the cold at the thin membrane of their walls, a battle they were destined to lose, BTU by BTU, every hour of every day. Theirs was a strategy of resistance. Halvard Nesheim's strategy was one of acceptance and redirection. He did not fight the winter. He looked at the most powerful and destructive forces on the prairie, the relentless wind and the endless snow. And he did not see an enemy. He saw a building material and a mason. He understood that you could not stop the wind, but you could guide it. You could not melt the snow, but you could stack it. He used the wind to carry the snow to his doorstep, and he used the snow to block the wind. He didn't build a fortress to keep winter out. He invited winter to build a second, better house around his first one. He convinced the cold to become his comfort. It was a quiet act of genius, a shift in perspective that turned the prairie's greatest liability into his cabin's greatest strength. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to the Dakota frontier. If you found this story of ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of forgotten wisdom. We believe the past has lessons for the future, and your support helps us uncover them. What other old-world techniques have you seen that were perfectly suited for a new environment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, based on historical building practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The principles of thermodynamics are real. Anyone attempting to apply historical building techniques today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.